When they're alive, you can enjoy watching them struggle. When they're dead, you can enjoy tearing out their guts. Tales are things you get to enjoy twice. Well, we're talking LTCs rather than stories, but the sentiment is still applicable. Hi everybody, this is Toffee with a somewhat different video from my usual fare. I've done a lot of LTCs, and some folks have asked me about how I do what I do. At the outset, I should state that a lot of what I'm going to talk about is derived from the work of LTCers who have come before me, in particular Don151, Mecha, and Valkama, also known as Fire Emblem. I came up with my LTC process after watching theirs and noticing an underlying structure common across multiple runs, and people who've interacted with me on Discord have probably seen me refer to it as the algorithm. This video is an adaptation slash expansion of a Reddit post I wrote back in 2020 that outlined my understanding of this. The theory I'm going to outline is primarily meant for 100% growth runs with any amount of rigging allowed, which are the kind that I've specialized in, but some of these ideas can be applied in other domains as well. Fire Emblem is a game where you play against an AI to achieve predefined objectives by moving units on a square grid and has combat that can be described by simple arithmetic. This definition is at the heart of the algorithm. The objectives of almost all Fire Emblem chapters, and most ROM hacks too for that matter, fall into a few categories, and there are consistent approaches that help calculate the turn floors and the strategies to try to achieve these turn floors. Generally, the algorithm assumes that any enemy unit can be one-rounded and that player units can survive any kind of combat as long as you rig hard enough. This is most often true in 100% growth runs with arbitrary rigging, hence why I say the algorithm is tailored towards those, but not all violations of those assumptions correspond to turn losses. It often just means you need to try to fudge the strategy prescribed by the algorithm a bit to make it work. The arcane skills at the heart of optimized LTCs are counting squares, doing math, and manipulating the AI. Counting squares is just that, counting squares. The key here is which squares you need to count. You need to identify the critical squares units need to reach for a given map and count the number of tiles of movement from the starting tiles to the critical square. For flyers, this is just the number of squares, while for other units, you need to identify the shortest path factoring in movement costs. Once you know the critical squares you need to get a unit to, you can estimate how many turns it will take to get there by dividing the distance to the square by the movement of the unit who needs to get there. In games with rescue dropping, generally the fastest way to get to a particular square without burning limited resources such as warp or rescue uses is in the saddlebags of the highest move unit in your army, possibly with some assistance from a dancer. Once you've worked out the critical paths, you try to arrange a deployment formation to put units in good enough deployment slots to reach the squares they need to on the turns they need to. There are also plenty of ways to boost units a few extra squares, which can sometimes be key to saving turns. Several methods of gaining extra squares all involve rescue dropping. When a unit drops another unit forward, they effectively grant them an extra square of movement over their own, which can be worth even more if it's used to avoid walking into dense terrain. For the purpose of these explanations, we will assume there is a critical path to the destination, that enemies will never impede us, and that we don't need to deal with any one-tile wide choke points that prevent units from using their full movement when they need to. With this in mind, because we're talking about large numbers of squares, I will represent where units end their turns with a number beneath them. This number represents how many squares into the critical path a unit is located. Infantry rescue drops are rather clunky due to the lack of canto, but it is still possible to use them to gain squares. I dub this technique a matryoshka rescue chain. In an MRC, we start with a high con infantry unit starting at the front and give them a lighter unit to drop forward, gaining a square. Then, we can give this lighter unit an even lighter unit to drop forward to gain another square and so on, ending with the lightest unit who can still do whatever task we want them to do. MRCs aren't used much in practice because games usually give you mounted units pretty quickly. With mounted units, Canto and the generous mounted aid formula means they can gain squares much more consistently. There are three classic techniques for gaining squares with mounted units without a dancer: the 3-step shuffle, the 2 paladin scooch, and the 3 paladin scooch. Each of these also has variations that require extra units but have some desirable properties for LTCs in practice. All of these techniques apply generally to mounted units with some X and X-1 move, but to streamline the explanations we will use GBA Cavaliers with 7 move and Paladins with 8 move. In the basic 3-step shuffle, which is a little misleadingly named since it actually has 4 steps, we need 2 Cavaliers, let's say Sane and Kent, and 1 Paladin, let's say Marcus. On turn 1, Sane is rescued while Marcus moves his full movement. On turn 2, Sane is given to Marcus, who drops him forward at the edge of his movement range. On turn 3, Marcus rescues Kent and moves 7 squares, one less than his maximum, and Sane takes and drops Kent forward. On turn 4, Sane and Kent rescue drop Marcus forward, with the final result being Marcus gaining a square over what he otherwise could have reached by using his full movement every turn. The 3-step shuffle lets you gain 1 square every 4 turns. There are a few different extensions to the 3-step shuffle that let you gain a square faster. If there are two starting squares that are equivalent in terms of distance to the final destination, then steps 1 and 2 can be combined by having Sane rescue Kent and Marcus take drop Kent forward on turn 1 to gain the first square in 3 turns rather than 4. Another variation that can be used when multiple 3-step shuffles are needed is to combine steps 1 and 2 by rescuing a cavalier ahead of time and giving them to Marcus at the start of any 3-step shuffle after the first one, which will again permit gaining a square in 3 turns rather than 4. In the 3-step shuffle, the unit at the back of the trio has a free action to possibly kill an enemy in the way on turns 3 and 4 for the basic version, or 2 and 3 for the faster extension. Clearing out enemies on turns 1 and 2 for the basic version or on turn 1 of the faster extension depends on the exact starting formation and location of enemies. Let's go to the next technique. In the basic 2 paladin scooch, we have 2 paladins. Here, Marcus and Isadora. The one further ahead, Marcus, picks up the one lagging behind Isadora on turn 1 and then drops her ahead to gain a square on turn 2. This version is a little impractical since a unit on the front lines carrying another is likely to fail the criterion that they wander around all enemies attacking them and just get blocked owing to the ability to kill enemies being hampered. Once again though, there are extensions to this technique. A better version is to have some other unit rescue Isadora on turn 1 and give them to Marcus on turn 2 to drop. A variation that avoids having to end turns with units carrying other units near the front lines is to use Marcus, Isadora, and an extra cavalier, let's say Lowen. In this version, on turn 1, Marcus and Isadora rescue drop Lowen forward. On turn 2, Lowen rescues Marcus and moves 6 squares, one less than his maximum. Isadora then uses her full movement to take and drop Marcus forward, gaining a square over a paladin moving their full movement for 2 turns. Any of these versions can be repeated to gain 1 square every 2 turns. The version with the cavalier has a free player phase action each turn to help clear the way. Much like the 3-step shuffle, it is possible to gain the first square a turn earlier if there are 2 equivalent starting squares by having Lowen rescue Isadora and having Marcus take and drop Isadora forward. Additionally, if on the turn Lowen is to be rescue dropped forward, 2 player phase actions are needed to clear the way. It is still possible to stay on schedule by giving another cavalier, like Sane, to the paladin who needs to do the drop. The last technique in this list is the 3 paladin scooch. In the 3 paladin scooch, we have 3 mounted units with 8 move, say Marcus, Isadora, and promoted Florina. The one who is furthest behind, Florina, is rescued by the one in the middle, Isadora, and dropped by the unit who is furthest forward, Marcus, ending up 1 square ahead of where she could have been if she just started from the best spot and moved her full movement. The 3 paladin scooch lets you gain 1 square every turn, and the unit furthest behind has a free player phase action which can be used to kill an enemy in the way, or to drop some other unit forward. Something to note is that pulling off a 3 paladin scooch on turn 1 does rely on a favorable deployment at the start of the map, but usually within a turn or two you can start doing 3 paladin scooches regardless of the initial formation. Much like the 2 paladin scooch, if 2 player phase actions at the front are required on a turn, then you can preserve the gain of squares by handing off another 8 move unit to the lead on that turn. Some Fire Emblem games also add movement skills that help gain extra squares. Shove can give any unit 1 extra square of flyer movement and is easy to chain for large movement boosts on turn 1. Swap can also do this, but it tends to be harder to chain since the swapping unit needs to move ahead of the target. Smite and Reposition can boost units 2 tiles, with Reposition occasionally allowing complete terrain skips, such as a flyer repositioning units across a cliff. Dancers are an entire other source of extra squares that I have barely acknowledged until now. Dancers let a unit take an extra turn, which obviously translates to extra squares. However, they have a few limitations. They tend to have less movement than the highest movement units, and usually have close to or straight up non-existent combat, and tend to be pretty squishy on top of that. This usually makes enemies beeline for them, which violates one of the assumptions of the algorithm that all combat can be manipulated to end with the enemies dead. Dances are complicated in that it's hard to directly estimate how many squares they can supply, but generally their movement can be boosted by having a couple of mounted units rescue drop them around. You can always gain about 6 squares depending on the exact starting formation just by dancing for a unit on turn 1. Dancing usage is very erratic and highly dependent on the map and even the nature of the LTC. Dancers can directly help save turns, but they can also help units grind staff rank or self improve. When looking for a turn save with a dancer, it can be helpful to first try to identify critical squares where a dance has to happen on a particular turn, and then looking for ways to get the dancer to set critical square on that particular turn. There are also a whole lot of game specific tricks which I'm not going to get into because I want this video to end before I die of old age. The most common of these is rescue staff manipulation. The rescue staff's destination priority changes from game to game, as well as its exact behavior, but the basic idea is to pack units around your rescue staff user to change where the staff target ends up. In some games, this can even be used to put a unit across impassable terrain, acting as a budget warp staff. Rescue staff manipulation can also take advantage of enemy units for the packing. The math in Fire Emblem is typically basic arithmetic and is mostly done for combat. As long as you know the formulae any game uses to calculate damage output and understand how hit rates work, that should be good enough. Critical hits and RNG based proc skills are basically free damage multipliers in a completely rigged context, though they tend to be unpleasant to rig, so strategies that don't rely on too many of them are preferable. In the cases where the enemies can't just be one-rounded and they block the way, you can add a critical square for another unit to finish the job, and that way continue to use the algorithm. AI manipulation is the most legitimately arcane skill, and it is mostly learned through experience. We do know a lot about the behavior of the AI in several of the Fire Emblem games, but you'll probably learn it faster by playing the game and consulting the AI documentation only when you really need to massage the AI to act a certain way. LTCs also feature management of limited resources. The most salient ones to the planning of a run are typically long range weaponry like siege tomes and ballistae, and transportation staves like the warp and rescue staves. To determine the optimal usage of these, you need to work out exactly how many turns they can save on each map, factoring in the treasure you miss as a result of saving these turns, and choose the allocation that is best overall. In theory, this can be a very taxing bit of math to do, but in practice, the way a lot of games are designed, they do not give you these limited tools until you are some ways into the game, which means the actual space of allocation strategies to search through is considerably reduced. Well, we've gone over a lot already, and this is a good place to end part 1. Next time, we will go over how to work out turn flows with the easier objectives in Fire Emblem with some examples. See you then!